NRBS board has been working hard on a number of things for a number of years, and they are coming to fruition, I'm glad to say. One of them is the sponsor series that you're attending today. Other things that are part of what NRBS has been involved in have included the podcast that is spearheaded by Dr. Rosenthal, Healthy Brain, Happy Body. The most recent addition to that is his interview with Dr. SCHAFFER that goes beyond the presentation that you'll see today. We are about to launch the CE series for this year. If you're an NRBS member, it's a super good deal. There's 8 presentations. I think it's $150. You'll be getting an email about that. And I think we are, in fact, running a special, if you're not a member, to join and get a discounted rate so that you can access the CE series. We've got a nice bunch of presenters this year. Let's see. We've got Dr. SCHAFFER's podcast is up. Next week, Dr. Mueller's podcast will be up, and he is the first presenter in the CE series. For today, I'd like to ask that while Dr. SCHAFFER is presenting, save your questions. You can put them in the chat, and I will collect them and kind of collate them, and we'll have time to go over them at the end. The webinar is being recorded. You'll be able to access it in about a week. And if you want the PowerPoint slides, we're going to put Dr. SCHAFFER's email in the chat, and please reach him directly if you want the PowerPoints. They will not be available through NRBS. All right. Did I miss anything? Good. Okay. I was first introduced to Dr. SCHAFFER during a presentation he made at AAPB, and I don't want to say how many years ago that was. But that's what really convinced me that heart rate variability needed to be a component of our practice. And we use it very regularly. Right now, we have 2 people training on heart rate variability upstairs. Dr. SCHAFFER is a biological psychologist. He consults on heart rate variability, physiological psychology, psychopharm, and he's taught at Truman University since 1975. He's the owner of Biosource software, Biosource software, thanks, got it. And there are lots of educational resources for biofeedback, heart rate variability, neurofeedback, and QEEG. That's been going on since 1978, and it's a really rich resource for you. He's been named by AAPB as a distinguished scientist. He's been the president of AAPB. He's had BCIA positions, including chair, treasurer, biofeedback task force director, things I'm not even naming. This year, he's the recipient of the Don Moss Servant Leader Award that he'll be receiving later in May. He's had an abundance of research, and many publications have appeared in peer-reviewed journals. He teaches biofeedback, neurofeedback, independent of equipment, software solutions, normative databases, and you'll even see he's like the most unbiased person we're going to get lectures from, so it's even free of a personal perspective. He's a data guy. In his free time, he supports many, many students and creates blogs and comics and cartoons. There's a side of him you won't see today. So I'd like to welcome him and thank him very much for being a participant and a sponsor for NRBS. Thank you, Fred. Take it away.
I am honored, of course, to be here with you.
How we spoke to him to try and sell him some stuff.
And I'm honored also by Saul Rosenthal's wonderful interview with me. I'm going to talk about improving client care by dispelling HRV myths. And what you're seeing are webtoons that we commissioned. My son and I scripted, and then an artist in Indonesia drew. And you'll find them throughout the presentation, and they'll be available in our handout. This is just some APA boilerplate. We created or purchased our graphics. Here are the educational objectives that I will not read at you, but we will go over them in the course of the presentation. We also invite you to visit our growing watercolor portrait gallery of leaders in our field. It's on our website under resources. This is one of the most recent additions. And here are some references that you might consider that can be found at AAPB's bookstore. Here's a wonderful book by Ina Hazan that I use in my classroom.
Hey, Fred, can you all please mute yourselves so that the only voice that we're hearing is Dr. Schaffer? Thank you.
We love children, but probably not on webinars. And here is an example of our Real Genius series that Danny also draws. It's a series about science literacy and touches on issues in biofeedback and neurofeedback. We are grateful to the late Yevgeny Vashilo, Branya Vashilo, and Paul Lair for inspiration, encouragement, and support for our research. Here's our first topic, cardiovascular health. Here are the two myths.
Right, let's see if I've got a...
And again, please mute yourself if you haven't already. The myths being variability is good, stability is bad, and a healthy heart is a metronome. Let's tackle the first one. Variability is good, stability is bad. Heart rate variability is wonderful. Blood pressure variability is dangerous. We require blood pressure stability under constant workloads. And of course, blood pressure should change when the workload changes. This was a graphic that we adapted, and it shows the mean of blood pressure over time. This was a graphic used by Dr. Gewurz. And we want it to be relatively stable as long as workloads are stable. And so here is the myth is variability is bad, stability is good. The fact, we want relatively stable mean heart rates, but high variability in instantaneous values. And greater heart rate variability is associated with greater health and performance. You may recognize the presenter. This is Ina Hazan. And in this graphic, you will see
so I just think I need to
rate.
almost punish myself more because I know I feel rubbish after I've done it.
Please mute yourself. Thank you. And here you have heart rate changing over time, and this waveform represents breathing. A second myth is that a healthy heart resembles a metronome. Back in 2014, I made the case with Roland McCready and Christopher Zur that the opposite is true. When the time intervals between successive heartbeats significantly changes across each breathing cycle, this shows the cardiovascular system can effectively modulate or adjust vagal tone. The reason we care about variability and complexity is that this is crucial to homeostasis. Our cardiorespiratory system needs the flexibility to cope with an uncertain and changing environment. The reason we care about HRV metrics is that they are associated with regulatory capacity, health, and performance, and they do predict illness and death. This is a graphic I created using Dolly. I have no idea where they sourced the components from. And this is a record that shows healthy variability. Danny drew this for us, and you see that the time intervals, the interbeat intervals, differ significantly. In contrast, this is a heart that may soon need a pacemaker because the time intervals between adjacent beats are identical. This is a heart that cannot quickly adjust to changing demands. And by changing demands, I mean things as simple as getting off a couch or running for a bus. And here is our web tune. A healthy heart is not a metronome. Well, shouldn't heart rate always be stable, like 75, 75, 75 beats per minute? No, there's no variability in your example. That's a heart driven by a pacemaker or that will soon need one. Why is heart rate variability critical to health? HRV supports homeostasis by providing the flexibility to cope with uncertain and changing environments. Well, what about performance? Increased HRV allows elite athletes and special forces operators to achieve optimal performance. High HRV enables them to mobilize and utilize limited self-regulatory resources like focus, attention, and stress tolerance. Topic 2, HRV sources. One of the sources of, I think, myths about what comprises HRV came from research using tilt tables. Now, tilt tables are used to provoke a sympathetic response. And here is a graphic that we purchased from Shutterstock showing a tilt table as a way to, for example, help explain to examine the causes of fainting. And so you go from here up to here, and this can provoke a cardiovascular response. Well, the major sources of the heart rate variability when measured over short periods are respiratory sinus arrhythmia, the baroreceptor reflex, and the vascular tone rhythm. And these are all exclusively parasympathetic, vagal. In the HRV sources graphic was one that I created. And here we see respiratory sinus arrhythmia at the top, followed by the heart rate baroreflex and vascular tone baroreflex, all responsible for increased vagal tone, and read vagal as parasympathetic in HRV. Now let me unpack this. So respiratory sinus arrhythmia is heart rate speeding and slowing across each breathing cycle. And it's the primary and entirely parasympathetic source of HRV. And so here in a screenshot that I took, we have instantaneous heart rate and across the breathing cycle. In the graphic adapted with permission from Elite Academy, the blue waveform represents the breathing cycle, and the red signals are heartbeats. And notice at the start of the breathing cycle, they're more closely packed together. And that's because at this point, heart rate speeds. Notice that they're farther apart towards the middle to the end, representing the fact that heart rate slows. Inhalation partially disengages the vagal brake, and this speeds heart rate. And this is purely parasympathetic. And the following graphics were inspired by Dr. Gewirtz and created by our artist Danny. And so the foot's off the brake and heart rate is increasing. Now, during exhalation, the foot is back on the brake and heart rate slows. Yevgeny Vaishilev's two closed loop model described the heart rate and vascular tone baroreflex as closed loops. And they proposed that stimulating one closed loop activates its counterpart. I have no idea where these scrawls came from. I'm going to see if I can remove this. I may not be able to. And here is their graphic. So this was adapted from Yevgeny Vaishilov.
Others.
And here is the heart rate control system, the vascular tone control system, and the total blood pressure control system. And what we see down here is icons for lungs. So breathing can activate this baroreflex, and muscle, skeletal muscle contraction can activate it. And then much more slowly, you have the vascular tone baroreflex, and here muscle contraction, slow-paced muscle contraction at the very same rate as with breathing can cause an increase in parasympathetic activation. So each baroreflex is a potential target for heart rate variability by feedback training. Now, the heart rate baroreflex regulates immediate blood pressure changes to ensure stability. And again, although heart rate variability promotes health, blood pressure variability endangers it. Now, the vascular tone baroreflex regulates resistance blood vessel diameter. Now, a larger arterial diameter, and we have a graphic from Shutterstock on arterials, means lower blood pressure. Arterials that are around 200 microns in diameter may account for about 70 or 80% of total peripheral resistance. And so here is our summary webtoon. Myth: sympathetic activity plays a major role in heart rate variability. Fact: the major sources of resting heart rate variability are parasympathetic, including respiratory sinus arrhythmia, the heart rate baroreflex, and vascular tone baroreflex. HRV measurements. Here we have 5 myths, and rather than read them all to you, we'll just go one by one. First, very low frequency VLF increases during heart rate variability biofeedback training are sympathetic. Now, the very low frequency band comprises rhythms with periods between 25 and 300 seconds. So this is really slow. Now, there is uncertainty regarding the physiological mechanisms that drive this band. Now, excessive effort during HRV biofeedback training can trigger vagal withdrawal. And what I mean by this is a inhibition of the newer vagus, of the parasympathetic branch. And contrary to popular belief, nature reserves the fight or flight response for threats to our survival. Everyday stressors cause vagal withdrawal instead of sympathetic activation. And this is Stephen Porges's argument. And so we summarize it with a picture of Stephen Porges. Myth: daily stress is largely sympathetic, involving fight or flight. Fact: Stephen Porges argues that when we perceive daily stressors as threatening, we often respond with vagal withdrawal. We disengage vagal regulation of large internal organs, reducing HRV. 2, low frequency LF power measurements during rest contain a sympathetic component. Now, the low frequency band is comprised of rhythms that are faster than the very low frequency. They're between 7 and 25 seconds. And they are affected by breathing and by muscle contraction at around 3 to 9 breaths or contractions per minute. Low frequency power increases during slow paced breathing and slow paced contraction. And likely, this reflects baroreceptor and parasympathetic but not sympathetic activity. The low frequency, high frequency ratio calculated at rest, so the person's not on a tilt table, the person is not on a treadmill, is calculated in a way that makes it very unlikely that we would ever see sympathetic activity. And so it is controversial. At rest, it should really be low frequency divided by low frequency. There should not be a sympathetic component. And so myth, low frequency power and the LF-HF ratio strongly indicate sympathetic nervous system activity. And here we have a graphic that we adapted from one shown by Dr. Gewurz. And here in the green, it's kind of hard to see. You see very low frequency, and in the gold, you see low frequency. And in fact, at rest, low frequency power is primarily parasympathetic. 3, high frequency power measurements during slow paced breathing are valid. Well, the HF band is influenced by breathing from anywhere from 9 to 24 breaths per minute. The point I want to hammer home is that high frequency measurements are meaningless. They are invalid during slow paced breathing. And when you're breathing this slow, they can't serve as a proxy for vagal tone, which means parasympathetic activity. And here we have Don Moss. Myth, we should measure high frequency power during slow paced breathing. Fact, high frequency measurements are only valid when clients breathe at normal rates, like 12 to 18 breaths per minute. And in the graphic we have here, we have 18, and here is the breathing waveform. 4, we can directly compare HRV recordings of different lengths. Well, here's the problem. The length of your recording period significantly affects both HRV time and frequency domain measurements. And we'll talk about each in a moment. So cycle length dependence is a concept that's very important here. Cycle length dependence prevents directly comparing, say, 5 and 10-minute recordings because longer recording periods can capture more variability. Resting values obtained from brief monitoring periods can dramatically underestimate HRV, correlating poorly with 24-hour measurements. And so here is the summary slide. Myth, we can directly compare HRV recordings of different lengths. Fact, cycle length dependence prevents directly comparing 5 and 10-minute recordings. Longer recording periods capture more variability. And what he's pointing to is a 24-hour recording, and this was one that was used with permission from the Institute of Heart Math. And this is showing changes in what's called the SDNN index. So this is 24 hours. So don't compare 5-minute HRV values with 24-hour norms. 5-minute recordings underestimate heart rate variability since they exclude the influences of activity throughout the day and circadian rhythms on HRV. You may only perform valid comparisons between segments of equal length. And one of the things we discover is that when you're asleep, we actually will see greater heart rate variability than when you're awake. And so if we're just doing 5-minute recordings while you're awake, we'll miss all of this. 5, you should trust smartphone HRV apps. Well, HRV time and frequency domain values that we get from smartphone apps may be invalid because they don't either control for artifacts at all, or they do a so-so job. Popular HRV apps either do not clean data, or they perform minimal data cleaning. They are overwhelmed by abnormal beats like premature atrial contractions, manual data artifacting within programs like CardioPro from Thought Technology and Kubios from Kubios OI. It really represent the gold standard. Myth, and this is my son Zachary. You should trust smartphone HRV app values. And fact, smartphone HRV apps perform little or no data cleaning. Abnormal heartbeats overwhelm them. For example, don't believe a resting RMSSD value, and this is one of the most widely used metrics on smartphones, of 142 milliseconds in an older adult, because this is at least 110 milliseconds too high. And here I show Danny's drawing of an actual Fitbit display. And here I was measured at 142 milliseconds. There's no way in heck at age almost 75 that my RMSSD will be 142 milliseconds. More likely than not, this was 110 milliseconds too high. And the final dialogue is upload the interbeat intervals, that's a time period between adjacent beats, to programs like Kubios to control artifacts and obtain credible values. HRV biofeedback training. And here we have 6 myths. 1, try to relax. Anyone doing autogenic training, relaxation training, realizes this is a really bad idea. When clients try too hard during HRV biofeedback practice, they can trigger vagal withdrawal. Active volition, which means trying, may increase very low frequency power and produce unwanted autonomic changes. And these can include increased sweat gland activity, so skin conductance, and decreased skin temperature. So the myth is try to relax. The fact is trying to relax is an oxymoron. Effort produces vagal withdrawal, producing unwanted physiological changes. So instead of try, we want to encourage passive volition or allowing. 2, successful HRV biofeedback training always produces a 0.1 hertz low frequency peak. Well, if you train your client using a resonance frequency protocol, like the one pioneered by Paul Lehrer and colleagues, their target breathing rate could easily fall between 4.5 and 6.5 breaths per minute for adults. And Dick Everts has recently suggested that 8 breaths per minute often is a good rate for most children. The peak frequency is really the highest strength or amplitude frequency, and this depends on your client's breathing rate. Now, although breathing at 6 breaths a minute yields a 0.1 hertz peak, and you just divide 6 by 60, and that gives you 0.1 hertz, 5 breaths a minute creates a 0.08 hertz peak. Dividing 5 by 60, you get 0.083. So again, we have Don Moss pressed into service. And myth, successful heart rate variability biofeedback training always produces a 0.1 hertz low frequency peak. And if you look at the graphic, here is a frequency display, and you see the most power is just around 0.1 hertz. Fact, the peak frequency depends on your client's breathing rate. Training at 6 breaths a minute does produce a 0.1 hertz peak. However, your client's resonance frequency may be higher or lower. For example, 5 breaths a minute breathing yields a 0.08 hertz peak. 3, very low frequency power increases during heart rate variability training are sympathetic. Stephen Porges, Dr. Richard Gevirtz have another interpretation, that very low frequency power increases may represent vagal withdrawal instead of fight or flight. And this is a common conflation. If you think that all stress involves sympathetic activation, then you'll disagree with this perspective. But Porges and Gevirtz argue that we're not dealing in most cases with saber-toothed tigers or velociraptors, that these are smaller challenges, and in these cases, we simply suppress parasympathetic activity. And myth, very low frequency power increases during HRV biofeedback training are sympathetic. And again, we see very low frequency activity in the green. Fact, very low frequency power increases may instead represent vagal withdrawal, which often occurs during excessive effort. Nature reserves the fight or flight response for saber-toothed tigers and velociraptors. 4, when slow-paced breathing increases heart rate oscillations, this signals greater vagal tone. Well, when we slow breathing to rates between 4.5 and 6.5 breaths per minute for adults and around 8 for children, this does increase respiratory sinus arrhythmia, the speeding and slowing of the heart during each respiratory cycle. And respiratory sinus arrhythmia immediately exercises the barrel reflex without changing vagal tone or tightening blood pressure regulation. These changes require weeks to months of practice. Now, heart rate variability biofeedback can immediately increase RSA 4 to 10 times compared to a resting baseline. And here's a graphic from Gevirtz and colleagues that we adapted. When slow-paced breathing increases heart rate oscillations, it signals greater vagal tone. That's the myth. And the fact is, all we've done is stimulate the barrel reflex. And it's going to take weeks of slow-paced breathing to change vagal tone, which would be the natural log or log to base E of high frequency power when clients breathe at normal rates. And so here's the graphic that Danny redrew from Gevirtz and colleagues. And what this shows is at rest, heart rate swings or oscillations are only this big, but with biofeedback, they increase 4 to 10 times. 5, the best sign of HRV training success is high resting, low frequency power. Well, the best sign of success is actually high resting, high frequency power when breathing at normal rates. And the natural log of high frequency power is a proxy for vagal tone, which means parasympathetic tone. So high resting, low frequency power when breathing between, say, 11 and 18 breaths per minute is undesirable and may indicate that the vagal brake is stuck. So rather than being a sign of training success, it could be a sign of a dysregulated heart rate. And so here we have Don again. Myth, the best sign of heart rate training success is high low frequency power at rest. And once again, we see a frequency display for HRV, and we do see increased power in the high frequency band. But in fact, we train clients to increase low frequency power in the clinic to increase high frequency power during baseline. The next graphic is courtesy of Dr. Yuna Kazan. It shows high frequency power blue increased from 100 microvolts to almost 300 microvolts from pre-training to post-training baselines. Here, high frequency power is a proxy for vagal tone when clients breathe at normal rates without feedback. So here's pre-training. The person was breathing about 15 breaths a minute, and you see the highest high frequency value is somewhere around 100. You see this all changes during HRV biofeedback at 6 breaths a minute with a peak around 0.1. And then at post baseline, you see that the high frequency power is now close to 300. 6, high frequency HRV biofeedback asks clients to slow their daily breathing permanently. It definitely does not. HRV biofeedback training may prescribe slow-paced breathing practice up to 20 minutes 2 times daily, but then clients breathe normally the rest of the time, adjusting their breathing to their workloads. In the same way, in weightlifting, it'd be counterproductive to curl a dumbbell throughout the day. So Dr. Kazan reminds us that the myth is that HRV biofeedback training asks clients to slow their daily breathing permanently, and the fact is that clients practice slow-paced breathing in her model for no more than 20 minutes daily. They breathe at their usual rate the rest of the time. In Ina's training model, she only asks clients to practice 20 minutes a day. And that's after they build up to 20 minutes over a span of several weeks. In Paul Lair's model, there is the aspiration that clients will practice 20 minutes twice a day. The reality is they practice as they think they need it. And you'll find at the end of this a glossary and also my references. And now I'm going to stop sharing. And I want to, Angelica, let's see what the questions are.
Yeah, we've got a nice collection. Thank you very much. And I already know I'm going to go back and watch this again. I've told everybody in the chat, this is recorded. There's a lot of information in there. Thanks for putting it all together, Fred. This is very helpful once again. Okay, can high heart rate be changed with heart rate variability training? And I have a follow-up to that as well, actually. And that has to do with, is there a reason to not do heart rate variability training with an individual who's using a beta blocker? I would say ostensibly for high heart rate.
First, let me put this in the context of I'm not a physician. So take what I'm about to say with several grains of Morton salt. The literature suggests that you can use heart rate variability biofeedback training to lower heart rate. It is not the only thing I would do. I definitely would also include, and again, this needs to be in consultation with your physician, aerobic activity appropriate to your fitness level. Another thing I will suggest, and again, as an academic and certainly not a physician, if you are underhydrated, drink enough water or get the fluid from fruit or vegetables, because when you are dehydrated, your heart works faster, works harder. And so it is important to have adequate hydration.
And then as a follow-up to that, with your caveat about, offering medical advice, do you know if there are any guidelines for differences to expect for different medication classes?
And that does deal with the question of beta blocker. You do training with the beta blocker so that you can get benefit from training with a beta blocker. And yes, I'm trying to not make this into an infomercial, but rather to say on the BioSource software website, we have a post that describes some of the common effects of drugs on heart rate variability. And so I direct you to that post. You don't have to look at any of the other things on our products, just go directly to the post and it will tell you what part of the challenge with that type of with describing the effects of drugs is that you have to tease out the animal studies from the human studies. And that's what we've tried to do. And as soon as you do that, it's a lot harder to find useful information.
Okay. I'm going to kind of step away from the protocol here.
Go right
Dr.
ahead.
Carmen is another one of our sponsors, and he's got his hand raised rather than typing it in the chat. But he is an expert, and he's a longtime supporter of NRBS, and I want to be very respectful to him. So take it away,
Yes.
Jeff.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. First of all, this was absolutely a phenomenal talk. It's one of the best I've ever heard. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Second, which is unrelated to everything else, you're speaking at about 2 to 3 words a second, which is perfect. And most people doing presentations are flying at around 6 to 7 words a second, and nobody can process all the data. So
Yes.
That was also phenomenal. Now, here's a really hard question. AFib has become really popular since Apple Watches have been picking it up. But generally, when they pick it up, it gets diagnosed by a cardiologist as being accurately AFib. How does that deal with doing training? We're probably seeing a bunch of people with AFib. Can you do heart rate variability with somebody like that?
Yes. The challenge is when you are in real time, you don't have data correction. So you're giving feedback on heart rate variability that if they have if, for example, a train of AFib, that's going to contaminate your record. So the clinician needs to, after the session, go into appropriate software and clean it up. You still can do competent training. I'm more concerned about home training using HRV apps that are overwhelmed by AFib. Also, AFib can be just periodic. so that you might be fortunate during your session to have a client who is not showing AFib at that time. But if there is AFib, it's going to change the absolute value of your time domain measures. And by time domain, I mean values like the SDNN, the RMSSD, and so forth, as well as the total number of microvolts in, say, the low frequency and very low frequency and high frequency band. So you have to ultimately clean up the data.
So do you see any increased risk in doing the training?
I don't, again, I'm a non-physician. I've not seen anything in the literature to say that that would be risky, but you're not going to reinforce AFib. But rather, I think that your measurements are going to be off. So I would not trust the absolute values. I mean, what won't be off in general are the trends. Across a 5-minute segment, you'll have trends in your data. The trends will be generally reliable. Think of AFib as contributing outliers or extreme scores. But your trends will be okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And the other thing is, of course, the key is really to provide them with practice. If you're doing breathing, effortless breathing at whatever the best rate is. And as they follow a pacer, if you're using a pacing display, they should get better at that. And that will produce gains.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And thanks for your kind words. We'll not talk about how much I paid you to say them.
Oh, it's just a wonderful talk.
I second that. Some more questions, Fred. Whether it's sympathetic activation or vagal withdrawal, is the counter measurement the same? Meaning, is it parasympathetic activation?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's largely what we want to do is fix the bad breaks.
Mhm.
And so here we want to promote parasympathetic in Porteous' sense, the newer myelinated vagus, the vagus that allows us to socially engage with others, and the vagus that allows us to self-regulate.
Thanks. This next question, I think, leads us maybe into your whole next talk. So, the science being one part, and then how do we translate it into clients, right? So the question is, can you share how you would explain Baraflex to a client? And also the same clinician is asking, they're often seeing neuroscience research only discussing the Baraflex to explain heart rate variability. So how do you explain the interplay of the components to clients?
I am not sure. First of all, let me again be clear. I am not, just as I'm not a physician, I'm also not a practitioner. I'm not a clinical psychologist. So I don't provide clinical services. And that doesn't mean I'm going to duck the question, but it's important to have context. So the person who should be answering this question would be Ina Khazan or Don Moss or Dick Gevirtz or Paul Lehrer. What I will say is that when I talk to lay audiences, what I try to do is not go into the weeds with the two closed loop model, but rather what I do is I talk about respiratory sinus arrhythmia. And I use that as a entry point into understanding heart rate variability. I simply say, as you inhale, your heart rate speeds, as you exhale, it slows, and the change from the highest heart rate to the lowest heart rate is variability. And I think that the example of respiratory sinus arrhythmia, or RSA, is far more intuitive than a two closed loop model. So I don't go into the weeds on the baroreflexes. I do it with you because you are an educated, higher level audience, and you want me to show my receipts, and you want to understand the physiology behind what we're doing. But with my students, unless they're in a course that deals with biofeedback, I try to keep it simple. So I talk about respiratory sinus rhythm. That's something they can latch on to. They can understand, oh, heart rate speeds, now it's slower, there's a change, that is variability.
Yeah, I agree. Generally speaking, I don't get too much into the science with my clients unless they're a really unique client. But I feel like my role is to understand the equipment and the science, and their role is to understand themselves and how they're feeling. Nobody comes into the office and says, my heart rate variability is dysregulated. Can you help me fix it?
Yeah.
Right. So, but another, I also want to bring in Saul to this conversation, if you don't mind, Saul. He's got a lot of clinical background with this very thing. And also, one of the questions that came up was, where do I get training? How do I learn to do heart rate variability? And you posted, the link to the BCIA approved courses there. I will say we took Dr. Schaeffer's BCIA course. Man, is it detailed. Like there is not a single thing left out. But if you have any comments there, Saul, I respect, your input as well.
Oh, thank you. No, just the same as you. I mean, I would explain it as resonant sinus arrhythmia. As we breathe in, heart rate goes up. As we breathe out, so talk about them being wired together and synchronizing. And it's accurate enough, so to be useful.
Okay. Let's see. This question, I'm not sure, maybe you'll understand it. When do we encounter HF measurements with our biofeedback equipment? So I'm not sure. The high frequency. Yeah.
If you were to monitor, say, heart rate variability using a little finger sensor, a PPG sensor, or an ECG, which is less common, you would measure that when people are at rest and are not receiving feedback. So they're at rest, they are breathing at normal rates, and then you would measure the total power in high frequency. So you can get it from your biofeedback gear if you're measuring heart rate variability. And you just look for the resting low frequency power. Angelica, there was a question much earlier in the chat box about POTS.
Oh, I missed it. Okay.
And we don't have, Saul and I participated in the current edition of evidence-based practice in biofeedback and neurofeedback. That fourth edition was released some time ago, just recently, under the direction of Dr. Ina Hassan. I've not seen a literature review specific to POTS. The closest to that might be our literature review on syncope, vasovagal syncope, where again feigning, and there the evidence suggests that biofeedback in general may be able to impact and reduce the severity of vasovagal syncope. But I have not seen a separate literature review on POTS. And so while I can understand, I can recognize and see the potential for HRV to be a strategy for treating POTS, I am not going to claim that there is evidence yet of efficacy for it. And we have to be very, very conservative in not getting ahead of the literature. Angelica, what other questions do we have in our remaining time? And I am willing to stay longer if that is your choice.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, so let's see. There's a question about if I use a biofeedback system, how can I incorporate it? I don't know that we want to get into necessarily the nuts and bolts of that, but if you want to give a short overview of that.
Short overview would be add a PPG sensor. That is an infrared sensor that can detect both heart rate and heart rate variability. And that is how, that typically is a better approach than using the ECG, or what you may call the EKG, because the best ECG measurements are usually from the torso. We don't want people to have to undress, and there's a problem with wrist sensors causing too much movement artifact. So many clinicians find it easier to acquire heart rate and heart rate variability from a digit. The Institute of Heart Math has a brand new sensor that just goes on your earlobe. It samples at an amazing 500 times per second. We've just done a post on its accuracy. It appears to have acceptable accuracy for home use. And we were not paid for doing that evaluation. We did it because it was a nice challenge from my research team. And that's the Institute of Heart Math. And you can get it from, without playing favorites for vendors. I have seen it advertised on Biomedical Instruments website. I've seen it obviously advertised on the Institute of Heart Math. The challenge with using an earlobe sensor is there will be the possibility of people not having a strong enough pulse to be able to get a signal. Out of a group of 26, actually about 28 participants, there were 2 or 3 that we could not get a useful signal.
Mhm.
And this is probably true regardless of whose sensor you're using. For that reason, a finger sensor also makes a lot of sense. And they're putting it over a thumb when you have a weak pulse might be another option.
Okay. Yep. All right. Well, I think that covers our questions. A lot of people are needing to get back to their regular work day. This was delightful, very informative. And again, y'all will be getting a link. You can watch it again and again, share it, share the link. We're happy to have people view it. Thank you so much, Fred, for all the support you provide to the society and just at large to everything you do. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Take care now.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.